Well, welcome back, everybody. This is Module 3 of PMBOK 5th edition. Today it's project management knowledge areas and process groups specifically. Now we're going to get into the PMBOK. Now that we understand the organizational view and how projects fit in and contribute to their value, we're going to look at now how to actually run those projects under the PMBOK methodology. As you see here, this is Chapter 3 of the PMBOK, so you need to read that yourself to reinforce this knowledge here. And we're going to talk about the processes, the knowledge areas, and how they interact with each other at a high level. So let's get started. And we're also going to talk about project data. You're going to hear a lot about work performance data, project data, and that can be kind of a confusing topic, so we're going to look at that in a little detail, even in this module here. So let's talk again. Let's reinforce what project management is all about. So again, it's about the application. This is you, your project manager, and your team. Apply knowledge and your skills and the tools and techniques you use. Apply them to your project activities. Why? To meet the project requirements. That's the job of project management, to meet the project requirements. So what is a process? Let's read this. This is from PMBOK. Process is a set of interrelated actions and activities that are performed to create a pre-specified project, service, or result. That's a process. You have an input, you have an output, and your input is never the same as your output, or you haven't done anything. So you transform your inputs into your outputs through a set of tools and techniques, some transformative kind of activity to modify your input to what you want as your output, which then will be an input to another process. So processes, they're characterized in this manner by the inputs, the tools and techniques that can be applied, and the resulting outputs. Now, even though in your PMBOK, when you look at the various input, tool, techniques, and output diagrams in there, of which there are several different kinds that we'll talk about, even though you look at them and they do not specifically cite these things all the time, although most of them do, but if they don't, still, your organizational process assets and your environmental factors need to be considered even if they're not specifically mentioned, okay, because they may apply, they may have some influence, so you just need to think about that, and in fact that is a recommendation that is in the PMBOK, that you should do this. Of course, if they are specifically cited, then you'd want to pay particular attention to what they're talking about there, because they will help modify your tool and technique to produce the output you want. So, again, successful projects, you can tailor the processes if you need to. Stakeholder engagement is key, critical importance. If you overlook that, you're nowhere, because that's where your requirements come from, is your stakeholders. And you need to meet their expectations. And there are ways to monitor and control whether you're doing that or not, and we'll find that out later. And again, you want to balance these competing restraints, which are your triple constraint, your scope, schedule, and budget, or cost, and quality, the resources, here we're talking human resources or material resources, and risk. You got to balance all those in order to have a successful project. And here again we show, just to remind you, that this is your triple constraint. So here are the process groups. Once again, the initiating process group. Now, what do we do during this process group? What are the activities? What processes are within it in a general nature? Well, this is your new project or a new phase of a project where you're authorized to proceed. In the planning group, all of your plans for all of the knowledge areas are part of the planning group. The objectives are in those plans. Courses of actions are in the plans. The plans are basically how are you going to accomplish these things in general, and then you get specific later. The executing process group, this is where you actually build the work. You complete the job, you deliver the deliverables. Monitoring and controlling, again, is pervasive from beginning to end of your project. That's where you track, review things, you regulate how you're performing, and you report performance. And as I mentioned earlier at the beginning of this module, reporting performance, project data will be discussed here too. It's very important you understand it. And your closing process group is finalize all of the process group activities. Not just deliver it, say I'm done. There are other things you need to consider during closing. So those are your process groups. Now we've seen this before, where you enter, this is your PDCA, Plan, Do, Check, Act, one of the Deming quality control classic looks at quality management. So here we enter again. This is the business. This is before you have a project. You enter, they come up with their project recommendations, a project is selected, and then you formally start your project management processes with your initiating group and your project charter. Then you do all the planning, you do the executing, again it goes around a circle, you do progressive elaboration throughout your whole project, you monitor and control it throughout everything to make sure you're on track, make corrective actions, and finally you close and you exit either the phase or the project itself. If it's the phase, you go back and you start over again. Now, I mentioned earlier that there are a number of different diagrams in the PMBOK which say literally the same thing, but it can be confusing if you're just paging through there and say, well, what is this now? Why is this different? Well, here's another view, very similar, but we've seen it just to show that these two things are very related, even though they look a little different. So keep that in mind with these. This is PDCA, Plan, Do, Check, Act. Here's another graph which is really interesting. Up at the top we have the 5 process groups: initiating, planning, executing, monitoring, controlling, and closing. And at the bottom is time. Now, you may get some kind of question on the PMP exam about this in some manner, so you need to know basically how these, over here to the left, the level of process interaction, how they work together. Initiating, obviously you start at nothing. And then what do you do here? Initiating process speeds up, you get your project charter, it phases down, while over here your planning process ramps up considerably. That's why planning is so important in project management. And planning goes for a long, long time, and eventually it tapers off. And this line here is monitoring and controlling. Notice it starts at the start, it finishes at the finish. It's pervasive through the whole thing. And it kind of ramps up toward the middle as you're building. You make sure you're monitoring and controlling, keeping things on track, making corrections, and then it tapers off. And the last one is your closing process. You may have deliverables being met, being built here, so you actually start doing some closing, delivering deliverables. If there's multiple deliverables, you may want to deliver those in the interim before the whole project's over. But certainly towards the end here, it's going to ramp up and then finally close off. So this is a pretty good real-life example of how these things work together and the level of effort for each of the process groups. So again, I don't know what kind of questions they may ask you here, but just make sure you understand these relationships. Project life cycle phases. Here they are. Now, remember, the process groups are different in definition than project life cycle phases like we saw before. So here they are on top of this, so you can get a relationship. Here's your start the project. Again, you organize and prepare during planning, and they call it carry out the work. Now, these are official words, official terms that are in the PMBOK for life cycle, just like the initiating, planning, and so on are official words for process groups. These are the life cycle names. So you have start, prepare, and organize. Carry out the work. Now there is no monitoring and controlling officially in the life cycle definition. They just go to close. So you need to know these relationships in case you're quizzed on these. If they say, how many life cycle phases are there? Well, there's 4. There's not 5 like process groups. So just understand this graph. Okay, now this looks really confusing, but this is called a data flow diagram. Every knowledge area has one of these. Okay. I don't expect you to read this from this presentation here. Look in your PMBOK, and again, you need to have your own official legal copy of PMBOK so that we can keep our copyright obligations under control. That's why we have these graphics in here. So you need to have your copy here so you can see these without a problem. But that notwithstanding, this is a data flow diagram, and it shows here a lot of things. Here's initiating, here's planning, here's executing, closing, and notice over here again, monitoring and controlling is across everything. So let's look a little more at this. Okay, now this data flow diagram is specifically to depict all 5 of the process groups. When we look at the knowledge areas themselves, they'll each have their own data flow diagram, which looks similar but not quite like this. I wanted to point out that what some of these symbols mean. Obviously this looks like a project document because it's a typical document symbol. But over here, an organization is an entity with these little bookends that stick out, and different than a process, which we'll see in the next slide. Down here I want to point out that these dots here, like here, stakeholder register, make-buy decisions, and down here, final product, these are outputs from a process. In this case, it's the output from the closing process, and an input to your customer as your final deliverable. So they are these little dots. That's what that looks like. And pay attention to this little box down here. This shows whether the relationships are within the process group you're talking about with the dark dotted line, or external to the process. They go out of the process into another process, which is the lighter gray ones on here. And here's the regular process, which would have not sticking up bookends right here. So when you see this kind of rectangle, that's a process. So here we have a different diagram that I'm going to talk about in a little more detail in a minute. So we'll be right back. Okay, here, remember I said there are a number of different diagrams and graphics in PMBOK that basically say the same thing. And here's an example. Remember our Plan, Do, Check, Act diagram over here. And over here we have our process group data flow diagram. again, which is different than the actual knowledge area diagrams we're going to see, but they're very similar. But what we're doing here is to show you how one maps to the other. In case you see them in the PMBOK, you won't be confused and say, why two different things? Well, they're kind of the same. So we're going to flip this diagram, the PDCA on the left, and we're going to show you that here we enter the initiating process group up here in this diagram. Same thing, entered up here. Here's our initiating process. We're not there yet. And here's the business side of things. So here's our project initiator or sponsor, one of the very few times where there's actually a person in the entity box rather than the organization or the enterprise. And you can tell that how, because here's an entity, it's got the bookends that are kind of sticking up. That's what that symbol means. And it maps to the start project phase over here. Now, again, the dots are the outputs from one process into another. So what are the outputs of here? Well, this is the business again before your actual project starts. Your project statement of work from the business at a very high level comes out from the business. And you're going to progressively elaborate that over time to get your exact requirements all the way down to your work item level eventually. But it's a very high level statement of work. They want this. The business case is on there. The business cases are the financials, the rate of returns, your net present value, your opportunity costs, all those kind of things that allowed senior management to make an intelligent, informed decision of which projects that they want to undertake that fulfills and supports their strategic values and objectives. So the business case comes out, and here's agreements. And you might wonder, well, we haven't even got a project started. How can we have an agreement? Well, you might possibly have in your organization blanket orders with suppliers for items that you may need for this new project. So if that's the case, you do want to bring in and document in your project charter any kind of those agreements that may apply, so that you don't perhaps make the mistake of wasting time to try and recreate those purchase orders later when you already have one in place. So that's what that is. Now the next thing over here, now we start our first process group initiating, and what this does is maps up here to the initiating process group in that data flow diagram. Likewise, here's your planning process over here, maps to your planning process. Here's your executing process where you build the work, okay, that maps to the executing process group. And notice one of the outputs from executing is your deliverable, which is your output. So you execute, build, there's your output. And here's your progressive elaboration, back and forth, iterative, always improving. And that would be these two things together here, just planning and executing going together. Here's your monitoring and controlling over here in this diagram. And again, it's a background process. It's in back of planning and executing and initiating and closing, as you can see. Likewise, over here in the data flow, you can see that it starts up here and it goes all the way down here. This kind of ends here, but it should go all the way down through closing, because it goes through all of those process groups. Here's your closing over here in the plan, do, check, act diagram. Here's your closing procedure. And finally, down here we have our exit procedure, our exit process. And look at this. I don't mean process, exit phase. What does this map do? You wonder, what does that map to? You think, well, down here somewhere. Well, yeah, it maps to the product, because now that you've closed, your product is the output, is the final product that you give to the customer. So that's where this would map. So now that you understand the relationship between these two kinds of diagrams, if you see either one, you'll know what they're talking about. So now here's our initiating process phase. Here's where you define your new project, or if it's a phased project, you come back and start your next phase and you reiterate things and make sure you're good for the next phase and you go through everything again. But basically, for the first time through, you're going to develop your project charter. If you don't have a project charter, or if you have a project charter and the sponsor refuses to sign it for some reason, like, oh, I don't want to commit myself, but go ahead and do the project. No, you got to be strong. You got to say no. You need the authority from him to commit the funds, commit the resources, do the work, assign you whatever level of authority you need. So you need to do that. So the initial scope is defined, and that comes from the project statement of work. If you remember, that comes out of the business into the initiating phase. If your financials, your business case says if we're given this project, we need $2 million, and it's approved, your financial organization will have then earmarked $2 million over some period of time for you to do the project. Stakeholders are identified of those that you happen to know at that time, and you'll know the major players. You'll know, you may not even know the actual sponsor. He or she may not have been assigned yet, but you'll know, who your key driver is, your key person that is pushing this project to get it approved, plus a few other people. But you won't know everybody by far. That'll come later. And at this point in the charter, this is called a stakeholder list. It's not on the slide here, but it's called a list, as opposed to the stakeholder register, which is an official project document that has all of your stakeholders in there, and we'll see that in detail later. Project boundaries are defined. We're going to do this project, but we're going to not do this piece, or this won't go beyond this. You need to define the boundaries of the project at a high level in the charter. You may want to, well, you should define your success criteria right in the charter, even though it may be one of your organizational process assets, where they say, here's what it means. For your project, you may either adopt that or you may want to tweak it a bit, but whatever's right, you need to have it in the charter so that you know that that is what your criteria is, and that's what the whole project is geared toward. And the project manager is assigned in the project charter. If it's not assigned by name, Bob Jones, they'll say whoever the project manager is going to be will have this level of authority. You need to define that. And that gets back to, are you a functional, in a functional environment, are you in a weak matrix, a strong matrix, projectized, whatever it is, what level of authority. You got to have it there because that defines what you can do to commit resources, time, funds, whatever. You got to be in the project charter. And it is best if the actual name is assigned in the charter. If not, it should be assigned immediately after. And if this is a phased, multi-phase project, and you deliver in the end, and you come back for the new phase, you want to review your charter, make sure it's fresh, and update it again. Progressive elaboration at play here. So you need to get another authorization to proceed with the next phase. Here's your planning process group, your next process group. The primary activities here are, here's where you actually establish the total scope in great detail. Again, you're not going to say, here's my scope today, great detail, I'm done, build it. You'll be going back and defining it better, talking with your stakeholders, getting more information, making sure that what you build, if it's not built yet, or even if it's in the process of being built, that if there are changes, and it has to go through change control, right, are built properly. So the total scope is part of the primary activity of planning. Your objectives for the project may be tweaked a bit. That may change a bit. Your courses of action of how you do your scope management, time management, cost management, quality, procurement, human resources, all of those knowledge areas have courses of action defined in their management plans of how you're going to approach those things, and then you would actually do it under executing. The main output, just like the main output, and the only single output of initiating is the project charter, one output. Planning group, there's one output under integration management, which is your project management plan, and it holds all of those other plans, knowledge area plans that we'll talk about a little later. So you want to develop the project management plan under planning process group. Project documents are all your other project documents that are not part of the project management plan. We'll see that differentiation between those things in a chart coming up. And of course, progressive elaboration is always at play in planning. It's always at play throughout the entire project to make sure that what you are doing is still on track, it's the correct thing, and everybody loves it. So what we're going to do here, well, here's key benefit towards success. There's strategy, there's tactics, courses of action in planning that you want to document in your plan, and you got to make sure, again, that whatever you're doing here, planning aligns with your organizational goals. Don't go outside the fence for no reason. Keep it in the family. So we're going to take a short break. When we come back, we're going to talk about now the executing process group. Okay, now we're going to talk about the executing project group, the third of 5 process groups. Here's where actually the work gets performed. The job here of the project manager is to coordinate the people, coordinate the resources to get the work done according to the project management plan, and specifically the work breakdown schedule, which is what they're building, and we'll get into that later. But you also manage your stakeholder expectations here because they may change or they may be unhappy. You need to manage them here, but here's where you execute the work, and you satisfy the project specifications, which are how you actually build the work, which is what quality management will use to assess the specifications that you're building it properly. That's executing where the work is actually done. There may be changes to your resources, which could be changes to your people, to the materials that you need to do the work, and risk may change because of things that are happening. If you're building the work and your primary supplier outside for a major piece of equipment has a fire, and now you're 4 months late, that's a big risk that you need to compensate for, and it's a change, obviously. So there may be updates to your project management plan and its subsidiary plans, which are the knowledge area management plans. And if things are egregious enough and you can no longer maintain your scope, your schedule, or your cost baselines, you may need to re-baseline, which means shift it somewhere and start over and manage to that. You don't want that to happen if you can help it, because even though if you re-baseline and things go fine after that and you deliver according to your schedule and so on, if the customer isn't satisfied because you had to re-baseline, even though the product you deliver is perfect, you have not necessarily had a successful project in their mind. So that's why you want to try and avoid re-baselining unless it's of the stakeholder, the primary stakeholder's own volition. He says, I need this changed. That's different than having a problem because you mismanaged the project or some external factor caused you to delay and re-baseline. So it's important to try and really keep on your baseline. That is your guiding light. That's the reason you're there, to avoid change. Now here's the fourth process group, monitoring and controlling. Continuous monitoring. As we recall, monitoring and controlling, pervasive. It goes across initiating all the way through closing. And what you do is you track progress, you review reports, your practices, you're actually executing the project according to the proper methodologies. because you can have a change to your project processes and also a change to your project deliverables, both, whatever it is, you want to monitor and control it, and then you initiate integrated change control. Remember, integration in the list of the 10 knowledge areas, remember I italicized that? That means that's a special group, and its primary purpose is to control change and to integrate everything and make sure change doesn't go outside the prescribed project management plan. So integrated change control is part of monitoring and process group. Key benefits here: your project performance you can monitor, report on. You can forecast in the future with various tools and techniques where you're going to be in 3 months if you keep on this trend, or if the trend is starting to trend up too much or out of bounds, you want to do corrective actions to get it back in control so you can maintain your baselines. If you can't do that, maybe you got to rebaseline. Obviously then you can identify variances in your processes, and you can take these corrective and preventative actions to keep you on track. And finally, there's the closing process group of a phase or the entire project to be altogether, and you conclude all activities across all the process groups. You get sponsor acceptance of your deliverables and of the final project itself. You document your lessons learned. All your project documents are archived so that you and other project managers and whoever needs to look at them can look at them in the future to their benefit. Any agreements that you may have for goods and materials outside the company, or even inside your company with another department, you might have a memo of understanding for IT to create something for you to support your project. You need to terminate all those agreements cleanly so they're not hanging out there. And then you assess your team members. You give them a performance assessment, which goes in their personnel file and goes in the project file, and then you're going to release them to other projects or back to their functional manager. That's the closing process. If it is a phased project, you can go back and you can get a go, a no-go for the next phase. You can cancel the phase. You can postpone the phase, okay? Or you can say that the project and the phase is satisfied, go, no-go. This is where you do it in the closing process. You wouldn't, under executing, say, we're not doing so well, we want to cancel it. Well, you need to do that within the closing phase. Now, that doesn't mean you're going to skip a monitoring and controlling phase to go to the process group to go to the closing process group, because that's not how this works. Remember, they're all interactive, they're all working together at the same time, so that as you're executing, you can say, oh, we need to cancel this project. You go through the formal closing procedures and so on, and you cancel the project if that's what it takes. So closing. Now here we got project data versus project information, and also project reports, the 3 kinds of things we'll see. Let's talk about this up front so that later on when we get this we don't have to take a lot of time to talk about it. But project data is just what it sounds like. Data, raw information of project work. Raw data, unaggregated, uncorrelated, just statistics thrown out there. Like percent complete of things. How many defects did we find? We found 5 defects. Okay, so what? Well, there's 5 defects. You log them. We issued 3 change requests today. Start and finish dates. This is the date. Here's the date here. Okay. We spent, $500,000 last period on our project, and durations, just raw data. Now what you're going to need to do is transform that data into meaningful, actionable information, and you do that by aggregating these things, sorting them out, correlating them into like a deliverable defect. Now you can do trending. If you say I had 5 defects here today, and next week you report 5 defects here, data, well, that doesn't mean much, but if you start plotting it, you can see your defects are going up, up, up over time. So you got a problem. You got to take some corrective action or preventative action or both. So the raw data is just data. Information is transformed into something that means something that you can act upon, like change request status. Now, we have 5 change requests. 1 is approved, 1's on hold, 1 was canceled. It's better to know. You can track these things too about how you're doing. And your forecasted estimates. If you have things like start and finish dates, actual cost, durations, good numbers, but you want to transform them into actionable data so you can do forecasting based on those things. So that's the difference between data and information. One's just raw data. Information is aggregated, correlated, sorted out, and then come up with some actionable thing because of all that. The third type is as reports. This is the information that, according to your project communication management plan, knowledge area communications, according to that plan, you're going to take this information and make it look pretty. You're going to present it in a presentation format to the stakeholders that want that particular information, and that's your reports. It's the same kind of data as information, but you're not going to give them all the information. You just want to give them the information that they want, and it's all in the communication plan. So that's the difference here between data, information, and reports. Now here's our knowledge areas, and we're going to talk about these in just a minute. Okay, let's talk about the knowledge areas now. There's 10 of them, and what do they represent? Well, a knowledge area, and this is again a PMBOK definition, knowledge area is a set of concepts, terms, or activities that make up a professional field, project management field, or more specifically in our case, an area of specialization within project management, like scope management, time management, quality management, etc. for the 9 of the 10, integration being the 10th. Concepts and activities related to a particular field of concentration or area of specialization. There are 10 of them, and they can be tailored if you need to tailor them to meet your project needs. And that'll make more sense as we go if you need to tailor these things. Now, these knowledge areas, according to PMBOK, says that these are used, whether you know it or not, on most projects most of the time. You don't need to use them all necessarily. That could be the tailoring where you may not need any or one of them or something, but you know, the idea with the PMBOK methodology is you need to use or at least address in some manner all the knowledge areas to have a good comprehensive project that will support the project's success. That's the whole thing, project success. And what are the knowledge areas? Again, you're going to get tired of hearing this, but you need to know these things. Integration management. And integration management is primarily change control and things like that, and also your project charter initially comes out of integration management. And then your stakeholder management, human resource, and these are the order that we're going to take these in. Stakeholder management, human resource management, getting your team together, training them, assessing them. Communication management, how are you going to communicate with your stakeholders and your project team? You know, what kind of project information are you going to give them? You may even give them data so that they can create the information. And then what kind of project reports are you going to give your stakeholders, your presentation reports that they need and only what they need. And then, of course, scope management, how are you going to control the exact deliverables down to the very smallest detail. How are you going to control that? And that's scope management. Risk management. Risks just abound on projects. You know, if you think, well, you know, I can come up with maybe 5, 10 risks, you know, there could be hundreds, there could be 1,000 risks on a big project. I mean, there could. You need to manage them all and be aware of them and know what you're going to do if they occur. Quality management, of course, a big one. That's where you validate that the deliverable that you want to give, you know, your client is actually built according to the proper specifications. Time management is your project schedule, you know, and your sequencing and your dependencies, your leads and lags, your critical path, if that's what you use, or critical chain. That's time management, so that you build the stuff on time according to your scheduled baseline. Your cost management, everything you do that you build, you know, has a cost factor to it. It's either materials or it's human resources to do that. And you have a cost baseline that you need to manage to. And then you have your procurement management if there are external purchases or contractors that you hire, whatever it is. That's procurement management. So these are the 10 knowledge areas. By the way, in the prior editions, in particular the 4th and 3rd edition of the PMBOK, they did not have stakeholder management as a separate knowledge area. Some of those processes were embedded in other knowledge areas, primarily human resource and maybe communications. They've determined very intelligently now that stakeholder management is so key critical to the success of a project that they made it its own knowledge area in the 5th edition. So here we're back at our table 3-1, which is the knowledge area process group matrix with all 47 processes within it. Now we're going to take a little time and just go through this again so that you for sure understand and are comfortable with what this is trying to do. Here are your knowledge areas on the left. They're all there. And by the way, they start with 4 and go through 13 because these reflect the actual PMBOK chapter numbers. That's a PMI convention, and that's why these are on there like that. So if you look at chapter 4, it will be integration management, etc. Across the top, we have our process groups, all 5 of them right there. Everything in the middle are your 47 processes or activities. Up here, we're going to look at just the monitoring and controlling process group. If you go down that column, you'll see all the processes that relate to monitoring and controlling. Notice, like down here, human resource, there is no activity for that. You don't monitor and control your human resources in that manner. You do that in other ways, like over here under executing, you do your acquire the team, develop the team, manage the team there. A little different. But other than that, monitoring and controlling, they all have some kind of an activity with some of the other knowledge areas. So if we look across, take a slice against a knowledge area, which in this case is integration management, which will be the first knowledge area we'll talk about next module. I've highlighted here just the monitoring and controlling processes in that process group. And here we have monitor and control the project work, because you're monitoring and controlling what you're building. You're building it over here under executing, see, direct and manage project work. Directing and managing it, you're building it, but over here under monitoring, you're monitoring and controlling it, a different process. And you're performing integrated change control. You know, there's a number of big enchiladas here in these knowledge areas. This is one of them, performing integrated change control. This is where all this stuff, everything that changes goes through integrated change control, which is the primary reason they call it project integration management. And notice here, develop project charter, the only output of the initiating project. Over here, you're going to develop your project management plan, which is your guiding document to do your executing, and directing and executing the work, and so on. And you can't see it behind the bubble, but here's your closed project over here under closing. Now, one thing you're going to have to know, unfortunately, for the PMP exam is they'll probably quiz you on these numbers of how many activities are in each process group or knowledge area. And those are the numbers down the side here. And I don't know how you want to do it, you know, come up with a mantra, 667, 4343, 644. If you do that enough, you'll remember, and likewise on the bottom. One thing of interest, though, is these numbers on the right, which are the number of activities in each knowledge area, they're you know, kind of even, you know, 3434. Here's a 7, which shows time management is, you know, got a lot more activities than, you know, communication management. But notice down here, the planning process group by far has the more processes than any other process group. It has 24. Now, what does that say to you? That means that planning is pretty darn important. There are a lot of activities you need to do to plan before you can effectively execute the work. So that's just for your edification. But planning is extremely important, and planning is something that is overlooked by many, many project managers. And I may have mentioned this earlier, but project managers, sometimes they get a project, they just sit down in front of Microsoft project, they start whipping up their Gantt chart. They just start putting in things they think, and there's no way they're going to be successful in the end with keeping that project under control if they don't plan properly. That's what this is saying. But you need to know these numbers. Just keep that in mind. So somehow drill yourself so that you know what we're doing. So here we are again, knowledge areas on the left, process groups on the top. You have your process group activities in the middle. And now what is not shown on this chart that will be shown on your ETOs, here's your ETOs, input, tool, technique, and output diagram that we'll see later. They'll show you the actual inputs, tools, and techniques and outputs of each of these individual activities. Like this control schedule, 6.7, has its own input, multiple inputs, tools and techniques, and outputs. And they're shown on a different kind of diagram, which we'll see shortly. So here we're going to look at project integration management, that knowledge area across the top. And we're going to do that next time. We're going to do that in Module 4. So here we've seen the project management knowledge areas, the process groups, project data, how that's transformed into information and reports, and an overview of how to read and interpret that knowledge area process group matrix. So now that you got that, what we're going to do next time is we're going to look at the actual project integration management knowledge area. And it's got to do with Chapter 4 in your book, in the PMBOK. And we're going to do two passes through Chapter 4, by the way. The first pass is this Module 4, where we're going to look in great detail in the life cycle of a deliverable. I mean, that is why we're doing a project, actually, right, to produce a deliverable. And to get rid of all the fluff and all the overhead, which is needed, but to filter all that stuff out and only look at how a deliverable flows through all the processes, all the knowledge areas, inputs, tools, and outputs, that starts with your business case and ends up with a final product to your client. We're going to trace that through all these things to give you a better understanding of how all these inputs and outputs work, and how they're linked together, and how they go out of knowledge areas, come back into knowledge areas, and finally end up with your final product. So we're going to look at that in a lot of detail, and I think you'll appreciate in the end when you pop open your PMBOK later and you look at these things, you say, oh, you know, I know this thing here is 5 pages over here, here's where it comes out over here. So this is a big advantage to you, I think, if we do this, because I know when I first got the PMBOK, you know, you read these things, oh, that makes sense, it's an output, okay, and then you flip to the next knowledge area, you read it, oh, yeah, I understand that, and then you get to the next one and say, oh, here's an output, well, where did this come from? Well, it came from way back here. So it was difficult to get this whole integration thing under control in my mind, and once I did, it became really clear and made sense. So I want that to happen to you. I want you to understand, you know, how to read these things and how to flow through these diagrams so they really make sense to you, and that'll be a big advantage to you. So we'll do that next time in Module 4.